Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the Israel-Hamas war and the laws of war. Now, Sarah, one of the, I think, most despicable claims that I have seen made by these Hamas apologists has been to say that the targeting of civilians in Israel by Hamas, including babies and the elderly, is justified because there are no civilians in Israel due to mandatory military service there. How do you respond to that type of statement?
I mean, it's hard to even argue with those people. That's such a repulsive statement. I mean, to claim that babies, that elderly people are combatants is, I don't think that has any basis in law. In fact, there's prohibitions on targeting military personnel who are not on duty at the time. So there's no basis for that at all.
Brian, another claim that we've heard is that the Hamas massacre of civilians was justified as some sort of resistance to Israel's policies towards Gaza. And, the policies have had, consequences for the people of Gaza. There have been some terrible consequences. But what do you say about this notion that the Hamas attack on October 7th was some type of resistance? What does the law actually say about that?
Right. So the conflict that's been simmering, for years now, has taken place in a really kind of contested, legal framework where there are a lot of claims about, what Israel is doing as an occupying force and whether their conduct is legal pursuant to international law or not. And the same can be said for some of the response by Hamas and by Palestinians. So there's a lot of kind of legal contest involved in discourse, but what is absolutely irrefutable is that it's unlawful to deliberately attack civilians. It's unlawful to deliberately take civilians as hostages. And so, regardless of what one person's belief is regarding you know Palestinians' conduct towards Israel as legitimate resistance. Now that's a matter of moral and political belief, but as a matter of law is very clear. You can't deliberately attack civilians or take civilians hostages, and that's what Hamas has been doing.
Yeah, so let's talk about the hostages, Sarah. We know that Hamas has taken over 200 hostages into Gaza. I think the most recent count that I saw was from today of 224 hostages, and that includes babies, like little infants, actually. So Brian has said that the laws of war prohibit the taking of hostages. What more can you say about that? And how should Israel conduct themselves knowing that these hostages are alive in Gaza? Are there any obligations on Israel knowing that these hostages are there?
It's a great question. I mean, first of all, in terms of the laws, so we have the prohibition against the taking of hostages is found in many forms of international law. It's a contravention of international humanitarian law. It's a contravention of it's against the hostage taking convention. It's a treaty law. It's also a war crime. So that applies not just to states. Like if you look at like the war crimes listed in the Rome Statute, that obligates not just states, not just non-state actors, but individuals. That's the ICC's individual criminal responsibility. So it's a very, very wide, serious prohibition. In terms of Israeli response, I mean, my sense is that Israel is trying to do everything they can to get back the hostages. And I suspect that's a large cause of the delay of the ground invasion, because we know that there are hostage negotiations going on behind the scenes. And, we know that Israel and the US and every country that has nationals in the Gaza Strip as hostages, which is there's many, right? France, Germany, all of these countries have an interest in getting their people out safely.
Brian, I want to talk about the principle of proportionality because when we talk about civilians and the intentional targeting of civilians, which, as we've discussed, does not seem like Israel is engaging in that, but there's no doubt that there are civilian deaths. And when exactly is it that a civilian death is a kind of a war crime when it's an intentional target? And how does this notion of proportionality of weighing military goals to civilian casualties, what role does that play? We've got only about 30 seconds, but we'll follow up in the next segment. Just let me know briefly what you think, and then we'll move on.
Okay, so just very briefly, it's a war crime to deliberately attack civilians, but then if the attacker is aware expects incidental damage, so damage to civilian persons or property, they have to assess the expected incidental damage and then assess that against the concrete direct military advantage expected from the attack. And if the incidental damage is expected to be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage, and the attacker engages in the attack anyway, so that would be a war crime.
Let's go to break, and then I want Sarah's perspective on that proportionality rule.